For me, Leonard Miller from the G League Ignite is one of the most underrated prospects in the 2023 draft. This is floor and ceiling. Let's break him down. At 6'10", 6'11", with a 7'2" wingspan, Leonard Miller has prototypical size for an NBA forward. His role has evolved over time, and even just this season, but there are very intriguing flashes of offensive versatility. In October, I mentioned that Miller had my attention because he was a supersized point forward type. That was his billing coming into the G League Ignite program, but his impact on the court this year has honestly been a lot different to what I expected. Let's start there then, which takes us to the basket. Miller scores about 2/3 of his points in the paint. In the restricted area this season, he's shooting a monster 77% on fairly high volume as well. As the season has gone by, the Canadian forward has become much more of what I like to call a play finisher. The first thing I like about Miller's scoring at the rim is his timing. It may not seem like much, but Miller gets when to lurk into the paint or cut to the dunker spot. He'll take that one little step forward that creates all the space for him to score. Miller is aware of when and how to cut. Often, all he has to do is just catch and finish because he knows how to lose his defender. And of course, it helps that he's playing with Scoot Henderson too. On top of that, Miller's motor is really impressive. Even if he doesn't secure the ball on the first try, Miller will always go back for it. He'll fight on the boards too, but more on that later. The 19-year-old has also acted as the finisher in pick-and-roll situations. Miller has played the 5 a lot this season, especially after F.A. Abugidi's injury, which also brought forward this sort of change in role. Miller can still get stronger, but his frame is filling out nicely, and he's not easy to stop whenever he gets rolling downhill. For comparison, this is where he was a few months ago, but he's been really reliable near the basket in the G League. Prior to this season, Miller, like I said, had piqued my curiosity more because of his playmaking and fluidity at his size. I expected him to play more like this, in a more scattered role maybe, but that trades some creativity for some efficiency. These flashes from last year's draft cycle are still really interesting to look at. Having this tape and also having evaluated him in person multiple times, I think there's more to Miller's game than what you'll see if you only watched this season. However, I've also been massively impressed by how easily Miller has embraced this change. Even though the opening is there, he's not going to take a quick 3. Instead, he keeps the ball moving and understands what his team requires from him. This unselfishness, for example, can be seen with his rim running. He's agile and mobile, so if he goes north to south with intent, the chances are he'll pick up an easy bucket. And that's exactly what the Canadian Ignite prospect has been doing. Like I said in my last video, the G League is certainly played at a pretty frenetic pace. It's not as structured as the NBA either, but these opportunities in the open court should exist for Miller pretty early on in his NBA career. His body control stands out, Miller plays with long strides and above the rim. It's also his motor though, as I've been saying, those multiple efforts on offense. Because before, Miller still had the motor, but he struggled more with his finishing. Now he can use his length and touch while playing tough. Everything I just said really shows up on the glass. Miller snatches about 9 rebounds per game, with almost 3 of those being offensive boards. Again, Miller plays with awesome effort and physicality here. He's assertive and engaged, and that timing comes into play again because of how he tracks boards and then finishes. This and all of what we've seen so far is how at the time I'm recording this, Miller's true shooting percentage is about the same as Derek Lively's or Brandon Miller's. Now, these are totally different types of players, but my point really is more so about Miller's efficiency. The next step for him will be shooting more free throws. Right now, he only shoots under 2 a game. In terms of self-creation, the Ignite team mostly has Miller operate out of face-ups and around the elbows if he's doing that. A lot of the time, the Canadian forward will switch from left to right. I like this clip here. You can see the flashes of being able to put the ball on the floor for a dribble or 2 and make something happen. The process is kinda clunky still, but I'm sure teams would love for Miller to become a grab-and-go guy. He's adept at using his length to come up with creative angles to finish, even if he doesn't always get right to the rim right now. That said, he does play physical, no concerns about that. He'll bump, play in traffic, and over length. The same tenacity shows up in Miller's post-ups. Again, he has room to get stronger, but he's not exactly timid at the basket. Miller's not a bruiser, but he understands how to make the most of his angles and positioning while still making himself felt down low. In the post, Miller likes dropping his shoulder and then either getting into some sort of fall-away jumper, or he'll be a handful and work his way to finish right at the rim. Now, there are more expansive flashes. The three-pointer is an interesting one. I wouldn't call it a swing skill, but it will be important. We've seen Miller cash in on some threes this season, but this isn't really his bread and butter right now. I do think he has touch, but Miller usually only takes a couple threes per game, and he's only made a bit over 27%. Virtually all of these trades are assisted too, which we can see in the clips. For me, these makes are worth buying into, but so much as long as you can keep a long-term outlook on them. Outside of that, I'm pretty sure Miller's shot mechanics will eventually undergo significant tweaking in the NBA. He has this sort of funky, low push shot with a pickup that needs to be cleaned up. The touch is decent, as I've said, but outside of that, the mechanics definitely still need work. The overall percentage as well will need to go up. Miller's gonna have to make his wide open threes, and his versatility improving from deep would be cool as well. Right now, for instance, Miller barely takes any corner threes. All of this will be a process, but I think it's already started. Comparing the Ignite forward shot months ago to now after evaluating him in person multiple times, his base does seem a lot more consistent. His lower body is more on balance, and maybe he's a little more poised getting into his jumper. But when it comes to creating his own shot from deep, I think Miller is still really far away from that. In many ways, he remains pretty raw offensively. Miller comes from an unconventional path, being an anonymous prospect in Canada until he had a breakout post-grad year in Florida last season. Miller was actually eligible for the 2022 draft, and he participated in the premier high school events and last year's combine. In all honesty, I thought he would have gotten picked by the mid-30s if not earlier, but what this really means is that Miller remains early in his developmental curve. The Canadian has tons of room to grow, but that can also lead to some uglier possessions. One of the biggest things that stands out when I watch Miller is that he can still struggle to create separation when he's far away from the rim. The numbers back that up too. All of the good news is that he doesn't take too many shots from these in-between areas. He's probably not going to need to either. Purely in terms of his pull-up, that's still a work in progress. His gather from the mid-range once he gets into his shot is probably a little cleaner from deep, but you'd rather him take other shots. Going forward, I'd really like to see Miller keep growing off the dribble. The 6'10 forward is more fluid and coordinated than he is explosive, and that's fine. He's not super quick twitch, and I don't think he has to be at his size, but I'd like to see Miller be able to get lower on his dribble and then also tighten his handle. If he does that, then I think he'll have enough to get past slower forwards on the perimeter, and then he's big enough to be a mismatch versus smaller defenders. Plus, keep in mind that he'll still get stronger. I'm not worried about Miller's body since he has a great frame. He can get off the ground pretty well when he has room, and as I've said, he has already gotten stronger. He's gonna have to keep working on his body, don't get me wrong though. There are times where he can lose his footing or kind of get blocked below the rim because he's not always capable of playing through contact. This is more important if Miller's gonna keep playing the 5 long term, or at least performing some of those functions in that role. If so, Miller's gonna need to become more comfortable too, doing some of the things that basic bigs do, quote unquote. For instance, I wanna see him make contact on this screen, or really establish post position in this play. Defensively, I'm less sure about what Miller's NBA role is going to look like. He's one of those guys right now who has all the tools to be impactful on this side of the floor, but Miller is still a long ways away from putting them together still. That's fine, he's 19, so the Ignite prospect has time. But I'd love to hear any suggestions about what his ideal defensive role in the league could be. If he's playing the 5, protecting the rim doesn't come naturally to Miller at all right now. He has 16 blocks in 28 games, again being 6'10", 6'11", and playing center. The biggest thing, and it does seem simple, but the Canadian sells himself out too easily. At this stage of his development, he's jumpy and really just ineffective defending the basket on a consistent basis. Like on offense, Miller also plays with a degree of grit and toughness on this side of the ball, but the reality is he wouldn't really be able to play the 5 against the NBA's best bigs at all. Of course, Jokic or Embiid would overpower him, but I'm also thinking about guys like Brook Lopez, Nick Claxton, or Ivica Zubac in those tiers below. Really, I can't see Miller guarding them. On the perimeter, my reading of Miller's defense isn't that encouraging right now either. The big thing here, I think, is his positioning. The Canadian forward is prone to taking some weird side angles where he's opening up his hips, feet, and body just way too much. Attackers can blow by him with relative ease, or at least a lot easier than they should be able to. This is the G League, keep in mind, so it's plenty of NBA athletes in there. But to be fair to Miller, I imagine that this is a huge adjustment curve for him. This is by far his highest level of competition to date. Within years, he's gone from Canadian high schoolers to world-traveled pros. Even guys who've played center their whole lives take some time to adjust to the NBA. And yes, the G League is not the NBA, but it's a lot of similar principles, former players, and pace and space. So even if his defense is rough right now at times, I'm more than willing to cut Miller some slack here. However, there's other stuff that's more about engagement and effort where Miller has to be better. Ignite's recent game against Memphis re-sparked my question of what Miller does defensively in the NBA because he was guarding real NBA prospects a lot of the time. In these clips, he's up against Jake LaRavia, the 19th pick in last year's draft. And Miller, well, he doesn't really know how to deal with him. LaRavia gets him time and time again on the perimeter and swishes 3 after 3. The smallest of details add up on defense, and Miller needs to do the little things more often. For instance, I want him to stay disciplined with this closeout and get to his man with high hands immediately. Or even these plays, they're not entirely on him, but I'd love to see Miller get to the point where he's more proactive about reading the floor and getting stops. If that comes though, it's gonna be with reps, and Miller is still so early on in his career that giving a verdict on his defense would be very unfair. A big part of that, and it might sound counterintuitive, but it's honestly his offense. I feel like Miller's goodness there with the flexibility, the fluidity, the motor, etc., eventually has to show up on defense once the experience catches up to the tools. In all honesty, Miller is not that disruptive right now. I said it earlier, at the time I'm recording this, Miller's played in 28 games. He has 16 blocks and 26 steals, which are subpar numbers. The more advanced metrics will tell you as much as well as the eye test. But that's not to say that Miller doesn't have the means to be annoying on this side of the basketball. I think this clip here sort of sums up where he's at. Miller is long enough to force the miss twice even if he's not really doing that much, and then he times his rim run really well to get an easy finish down the other end. So I've gotten the chance to evaluate and watch Leonard Miller in person many times this season, and to be honest, I think he is being a little underrated. I think he's flying under the radar, and it's because of what I like to call the Thon Maker effect, which is that when he was a virtual unknown, a 6'10", toolsy, ball-handling long forward coming out of Canada, everyone was really intrigued. Last year's draft cycle, I think, showed as much. But now that Miller is with the G League Ignite and his role has actually been streamlined, he's been more productive, more efficient, I'm not entirely sure I understand why his stock has seemingly fallen, or at least, why not as much attention is being paid to him. I think that there's a lot to tap into. What I'm most unsure of is his defensive role. Being 6'10" helps, having that 7'2" wingspan obviously is a big help as well. but I think it's going to be really interesting to see, which team drafts him and where they put him, whether they see him continuing as more of a big or whether they do flesh out more of that wing skill set on both ends of the floor. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, make sure to leave a comment telling me what you think of Leonard Miller, and as always, if you enjoy the channel, if you want to watch more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Take care, and I'll catch you guys next time.